She was 16 years old, 5 months pregnant, and standing alone at a Greyhound station in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, with $12 in her pocket and a duffel bag that held everything she owned in the world. Her father had driven her there himself. He hadn't said a word for the entire 43-minute drive, and when he pulled up to the curb and popped the trunk, he didn't get out to help her with her bag. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter he couldn't swallow. Molly expected anger. She expected a lecture, maybe even tears. What she didn't expect was for him to drive away before she'd even made it to the door of the station, his taillights disappearing into the evening haze like he couldn't wait to pretend she'd never existed. She stood there for 11 minutes watching the road, certain he would come back. He didn't come back. And 3 hours later, when the last bus had departed and the station attendant told her they were locking up for the night, Molly Foster walked into the Oklahoma darkness with no destination, no plan, and no one in the world who wanted her. She walked for 2 hours down a county road she didn't know the name of, until her feet ached and her back screamed, and the baby inside her kicked against her ribs like it was trying to remind her that giving up wasn't an option. And that's when she saw it. Set back from the road behind a wall of overgrown honeysuckle and wild roses gone feral, a farmhouse with boarded windows and a padlocked door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The lock was rusted. The porch was rotting. Every instinct told her to keep walking, but something else, something she couldn't name then and still struggles to explain now, told her to stop, told her to stay, told her that whatever was inside that house had been waiting for her longer than she'd been alive. Molly Foster was born in the spring of 2006 in a yellow house on Chestnut Street in the small town of Redding, Kansas, population 4,200, where everybody knew everybody and nobody minded their own business. Her mother, Linda, was a church secretary who ironed her husband's shirts every Sunday morning and believed that appearances were next to godliness. Her father, Dale, sold insurance and coached Little League and shook hands with a grip that left bruises, the kind of man who measured his own worth by whether other men respected him. They were not cruel people. That's what made what happened so hard for Molly to understand, even years later. They were not monsters. They were ordinary. They went to PTA meetings and donated to the food drive and waved at their neighbors from the driveway. They loved Molly, or at least they loved the version of Molly they had created in their minds. The obedient daughter, the honor roll student, the girl who would go to college and marry well and give them grandchildren they could show off at church. The problem was that the real Molly had never quite matched the picture. She asked too many questions. She read books her mother found disturbing. She had a laugh that was too loud, and opinions that were too strong, and a stubborn streak that Dale called defiance, but which was really just the refusal to pretend she was smaller than she was. By the time she was 14, Molly had learned to perform the daughter her parents wanted while hiding the girl she actually was, and the distance between those two selves grew wider every year, until she felt like she was living inside a costume she couldn't take off, suffocating in the skin of someone else's expectations. She was lonely in a way that no one around her could see. She smiled at dinner. She said yes, ma'am, and no, sir. She went to youth group and sang the hymns, and nodded along when the pastor talked about purity and God's plan for women. And at night, alone in her room with her journal, she wrote down all the things she was never allowed to say. The doubts, the questions, the furious certainty that there had to be more to life than this. She was waiting for something to happen. Anything. She just didn't know it would happen the way it did. His name was Tyler Beck, and he was 18 years old with a smile that made her feel like she was standing in sunlight. He worked at the garage on the edge of town, the one her father said employed nothing but drifters and deadbeats, and maybe that was part of the appeal, the fact that he came from a world her parents had taught her to fear. Tyler had dropped out of high school at 17 to help support his mother after his father left. He lived in a trailer on the south side of town and drove a truck with rust around the wheel wells and didn't own a single thing that Linda Foster would consider presentable. But when he looked at Molly, he saw her, the real her. He asked her questions about the books she read and actually listened to the answers. He didn't tell her to smile more or talk less or act like a lady. He told her she was smart. He told her she was interesting. He told her she was the only real person he'd met in this whole fake town, and something inside Molly that had been holding its breath for 16 years finally exhaled. They started meeting in secret, at the park after dark, behind the library during lunch, in the cab of his truck on county roads, where no one from Reading would see them. Molly knew it was wrong by her parents' standards. She knew what would happen if they found out. But for the first time in her life, she felt like someone wanted to know the girl beneath the performance, and that feeling was more intoxicating than anything she had ever experienced. She told herself they were being careful. She told herself nothing bad would happen. She told herself that love, because that's what she thought it was, what she needed it to be, would somehow protect them from consequences. She was 16 years old. She didn't understand yet that hope and planning are not the same thing. She didn't understand that the world does not pause to let you catch your breath before it delivers the next blow. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 4 days after her junior year started, sitting on the bathroom floor with a test she'd bought at a pharmacy 2 towns over, and a terror so complete it felt like drowning. She waited 3 weeks to tell anyone. 3 weeks of walking through school like a ghost, of eating dinner with her parents while the secret burned inside her, of lying awake at night, bargaining with a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please let it be a mistake. Please let it go away. Please let me wake up and have this be a dream. But it wasn't a dream, and it wasn't going away. And by the time she finally worked up the courage to tell Tyler, she was almost hoping he would make it better, that he would have some plan she couldn't see, some way out of this that didn't involve destroying everything. She drove to his trailer on a Saturday afternoon when her parents thought she was at the library. She remembers the way the light looked, gray and flat, a November sky pressing down on the world like a weight. She remembers the smell of motor oil and cigarettes that always clung to his clothes. She remembers the way his face changed when she told him, the way something behind his eyes went dark and distant, like a door slamming shut. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just sat there on his stained couch, staring at the wall, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and empty, and nothing like the voice that had told her she was special. "That's not mine," he said. "I don't know whose it is, but it's not mine." Molly felt the words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She tried to explain, tried to remind him of all the times, all the nights in his truck, the promises he'd whispered against her skin. But Tyler just shook his head, slowly, the way you shake your head at a stranger asking for directions you don't know. "You need to leave," he said, "and don't come back." She walked to her car in a daze. She drove home without seeing the road. And for the first time in her life, Molly understood something her childhood had never taught her. That some people will say anything to get what they want, and that love is a word that can be wielded like a weapon by those who don't mean it. She had given Tyler everything, her trust, her body, her belief that she had finally found someone who saw her, and in return, he had given her nothing, not even the dignity of the truth. She told her parents the next morning. She didn't have a choice. Her body was changing in ways she couldn't hide much longer, and the lie was eating her alive. She remembers sitting at the kitchen table, the one with the yellow formica top that her mother wiped down after every meal, and she remembers the way her hands shook when she said the words, "I'm pregnant. It's almost 4 months. The father isn't going to help." For a long moment, no one spoke. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Linda's face went white, then red, then a strange mottled purple that Molly had never seen before. Dale's jaw tightened so hard, Molly could hear his teeth grinding. And then her father spoke, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "Who is he?" Molly told them about Tyler. She told them everything, the meetings, the truck, the trailer on the south side of town. She didn't beg for understanding because she could already see in their faces that understanding wasn't coming. She just told the truth and waited for whatever would happen next. What happened next was worse than anything she had imagined. Her father stood up from the table. He walked to the phone on the wall, the old landline that Linda refused to replace because she liked the way it looked, and he called Pastor Davis at the church. Molly could only hear her father's side of the conversation, but she heard enough. The words fell like stones. Pregnant. That boy from the garage. Arrangements. Reputation. She understood then that her parents were not thinking about her. They were not thinking about the baby. They were thinking about what the neighbors would say, what the congregation would whisper, how this would reflect on the foster family's 23 years of perfect Sunday attendance. Linda started crying, quiet, wounded tears that somehow made Molly feel like she was the one who should apologize. Away. She had just made a mistake. The same away. She had just made a mistake. The same kind of mistake that millions of girls had made before her. The same kind of mistake that could have been forgiven if her parents had been capable of seeing her as a person instead of a performance. They weren't capable. That was the truth Molly learned that morning. Her parents loved an idea of her, and when the real her failed to match that idea, their love evaporated like water on a hot skillet, leaving nothing behind but steam and an ugly stain. The next 6 weeks were a kind of purgatory. Molly was pulled out of school, homeschooled, her parents told the neighbors, because of health issues. She wasn't allowed to leave the house except for doctor's appointments, where her mother sat in the waiting room with her arms crossed and never asked a single question about how Molly was feeling. She wasn't allowed to use the phone. She wasn't allowed to contact anyone from her old life, not that anyone was reaching out. Word had spread through Reading the way it always did in small towns, and Molly's friends had been forbidden by their own parents to associate with her. She was a cautionary tale now, a warning, the girl who had thrown away her future for trash from the south side of town. Her father spoke to her only when necessary, and when he did, his voice was cold and clipped, like he was addressing a disappointing employee. Her mother vacillated between weepy guilt trips and rigid silence, unable to decide whether she was more hurt or more angry. And through it all, no one asked Molly what she wanted. No one asked if she was scared. No one asked if she needed help. The baby was discussed only as a problem to be solved. Her father mentioned adoption twice. Her mother mentioned a home for unwed mothers in Oklahoma City, and when Molly said she wanted to keep it, wanted to raise her own child, the temperature in the house dropped so low she could feel frost forming on her heart. "You think you're going to raise a baby?" her father said one night at dinner, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "You can't even take care of yourself. You're a child. A stupid, selfish child who ruined this family because she couldn't keep her legs closed." Molly had never heard her father use language like that. The words landed like blows, and she sat there absorbing them, feeling something inside her shift and harden. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just looked at this man she had spent her whole life trying to please and realized, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she would never be able to please him. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. And if that was true, then she was finally free. Free from the performance. Free from the costume. Free from pretending to be someone she wasn't, just to earn affection that had always been conditional. She didn't know yet that freedom would cost her everything, but she was about to find out. The morning her father drove her to the bus station, Molly had been awake since 4 a.m., staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom and listening to the house settle around her. She had packed her duffel bag the night before, some clothes, her journal, a photograph of her grandmother who had died when Molly was 7, the $12 she had saved from birthday cards over the years. She hadn't eaten breakfast. She didn't think she could keep anything down. Her mother hadn't come out of the master bedroom, and Molly understood that Linda Foster had chosen not to say goodbye, had chosen to let her husband do the dirty work so she could preserve some fiction that she hadn't really participated in throwing her own daughter away. Molly didn't knock on the door. Expression of grim determination, that expression of grim determination that Molly would remember for the rest of her life. The drive was 43 minutes of silence. The radio was off. The windows were up. Molly watched the Kansas farmland slide past. Fields of winter wheat, barns with rusting roofs, silos standing like sentinels against the gray November sky. And she tried to memorize the landscape because she knew somehow that she would never see it the same way again. When they reached the bus station in Caldwell, her father didn't pull into the parking lot. He stopped at the curb, popped the trunk, and waited. Molly got out. She retrieved her bag. She walked around to the driver's side window thinking maybe now, maybe at the last moment, he would say something. "I love you. I'm sorry. Come home when you're ready." But Dale Foster just stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and when Molly opened her mouth to speak, he cut her off. "Don't contact us," he said. "Don't come back. As far as this family is concerned, you don't exist." Then he put the car in drive and pulled away, and Molly stood there on the curb with her duffel bag at her feet and her baby pressing against her ribs, and the rest of her life stretching out ahead of her like an empty road leading nowhere. The Caldwell Greyhound station was a small cinder block building with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects and plastic chairs that were bolted to the floor. A woman behind the counter told Molly that the next bus to anywhere was leaving in 2 hours, but a ticket to Oklahoma City cost $31, and a ticket to Dallas cost $44, and a ticket to literally anywhere cost more than the $12 Molly had in her pocket. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs. She watched the clock on the wall tick through minutes that felt like hours. And she tried to think, tried to plan, tried to figure out what a pregnant 16-year-old girl with no money, no phone, no family, and no friends was supposed to do next. The answer, she discovered, was nothing. There was nothing to do. Every option required resources she didn't have: money, connections, an adult who would vouch for her, a place that would take in an underage pregnant girl without asking questions she couldn't answer. She thought about calling Tyler, but she didn't have a phone, and she knew he wouldn't answer anyway. She thought about calling one of her old friends, but their parents had made it clear that Molly was a contamination to be avoided. She thought about calling the church, but the church had already made its position clear. Pastor Davis had been the one who suggested the home in Oklahoma City, the one that would take the baby and give it to a proper Christian family. And when Molly's parents had relayed that conversation, they'd made it sound like an act of mercy instead of what it really was: erasure. The station attendant, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a permanent coffee stain on his shirt, came over twice to check on her. "You okay, sweetheart? You waiting for somebody?" Molly nodded and lied both times. She was waiting for no one. She was 16 years old and 5 months pregnant and utterly alone, and when the attendant told her at 9 p.m. that the station was closing and she couldn't stay, she picked up her bag and walked out into the night with nowhere to go. She walked for a long time. She didn't count the minutes, but her feet began to ache after the first hour, and her lower back began to spasm after the second. And by the time she saw the farmhouse, she was running on nothing but desperation and the stubborn animal instinct to find shelter before the cold finished what her father had started. The night was moonless and thick with clouds, and she almost missed it. Just a dark shape set back from the road, invisible behind the wild growth of honeysuckle and roses that had claimed the yard. But something made her stop. Something made her look. And when she pushed through the overgrown hedge and saw the house itself, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and windows that had been boarded from the inside, she felt a strange pull, like a thread attached to her ribcage was being tugged gently toward the front door. The house was clearly abandoned. The porch steps were rotting. The paint had long since faded to the gray-brown of old bone. But it was a structure. It was walls and a roof. It was something between her and the November night, and right now, that was enough. She climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. The front door was locked. Not just locked, but padlocked, a heavy chain threaded through iron brackets that looked like they'd been there for decades. She tugged at it anyway, more out of frustration than hope, and the chain held firm. But when she pulled her hand back, something fell from the bracket, something small and metal that clinked against the porch boards and rolled toward her foot. A key, tarnished and black with age, but unmistakably a key. Molly picked it up. She turned it over in her palm, and she thought, irrationally, impossibly, that it couldn't possibly fit anything, that it was just a coincidence, just debris from a lock that had been changed years ago. But she tried it anyway. She tried it because she had nothing left to lose. And when the key slid into the padlock and turned with a soft click that echoed in the silent night, Molly Foster felt something shift in the world around her. A settling, like a house adjusting to accommodate a new weight, like the universe itself was making room for her to enter. The inside of the farmhouse was dark, but not completely. Enough moonlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows to reveal shapes and shadows, the suggestion of furniture beneath dust covers, the outline of a staircase leading up to a second floor. The air smelled like time itself, dust and old paper, and the sweet rot of abandonment. But beneath that, something else. Something that reminded Molly of her grandmother's house, the one she had visited as a child before Grandma Rose had died. Lavender and beeswax and the particular mustiness of books that had been loved. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her heart stop racing. Then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The floorboards creaked under her feet, but they held. The walls were solid. The roof, from what she could see, was intact. And as she moved deeper into the house, pulling dust covers off furniture to reveal a faded floral couch, a rocking chair with carved arms, a kitchen table with 4 chairs arranged around it like they were waiting for guests who had never arrived, Molly began to understand that this wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a preserved one. Someone had covered the furniture before they left. Someone had locked the door with care. Someone had expected, perhaps, that someone would come back, or that someone new would arrive. On the kitchen table, she found a kerosene lantern with matches beside it. She struck a match, lit the wick, and the room bloomed into soft golden light. And that's when she saw it. A photograph in a tarnished silver frame, sitting on the kitchen counter like it had been left there yesterday. A woman, elderly, white-haired, with eyes that crinkled at the corners, and a smile that seemed to be looking directly at Molly across the years. And beneath the photograph, folded into a neat square, a piece of paper with handwriting so faded, it took Molly 3 tries to make out the words, "For whoever finds this place. You're welcome here. Stay as long as you need. Everything inside is yours." Molly read the note 7 times. She stood in the kitchen of that abandoned farmhouse with a kerosene lantern, casting shadows on the walls, and she read those 23 words over and over, trying to make them mean something other than what they seemed to mean. A trap, she thought. A joke. A note left by someone who had never imagined that a desperate pregnant teenager would actually find this place and actually need it. But the note felt real. The key had worked. The house was here, and she was here, and she had nowhere else to go. She explored slowly that first night, room by room, the lantern held high to push back the darkness. The living room with its covered furniture. A parlor with bookshelves built into the walls, still lined with volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A bathroom with plumbing that groaned and sputtered, but eventually produced water. Cold, but clear. A kitchen with cabinets that were mostly empty, but not entirely. Canned goods lined one shelf, their labels faded, but their seals intact. Beans, corn, peaches and syrup, a 5-pound bag of rice. The kind of provision someone had left deliberately, thinking about whoever might come after. Upstairs, she found 2 bedrooms. One was clearly a master, a large 4-poster bed stripped of its linens, a vanity with a clouded mirror, a closet full of old dresses in styles that Molly only recognized from photographs of her grandmother. The other bedroom was smaller, simpler, a single bed with a quilted cover that had been protected beneath plastic sheeting. A small desk by the window. A shelf with books that looked like they were meant for a younger reader. Fairy tales, adventure stories, a collection of poetry with a broken spine. Molly stood in the doorway of that second bedroom, and she understood, without knowing how she understood, that this room had been prepared. Not just preserved, prepared. The quilt was clean beneath its plastic. The books were arranged with care, and on the desk, weighted down by a smooth river stone, was another note in the same faded handwriting. "I hoped you would find this room. I hoped you would stay. If you're reading this, then you needed this place, and this place needed you. Don't be afraid. The house will take care of you. And someday, maybe, you'll understand why." She didn't understand. Not that night, not for weeks, but she stayed, because where else was she going to go? She slept in the small bedroom under the quilted cover, and for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming about her father's voice or her mother's silence or Tyler's empty eyes. She woke to pale November sunlight filtering through a crack in the boarded window, and she ate canned peaches for breakfast, and she began the slow work of making the farmhouse livable. She unsealed windows one by one, carefully prying loose boards to let in light while leaving enough in place to obscure the house from the road. She swept floors and beat dust from cushions and discovered, in a closet beneath the stairs, boxes of candles and more kerosene and a hand crank radio that still worked. She found the well pump in the backyard, rusted but functional, and the outhouse that someone had built decades ago when indoor plumbing was still a luxury. She found a root cellar stocked with preserves that were still good and potatoes that had sprouted but were still edible once she cut away the eyes. Every day, she discovered something new. A sewing kit with needles and thread in 20 colors. A first aid box with bandages and antiseptic that had long since expired but was better than nothing. A wooden crate filled with baby clothes. hand-knitted sweaters and booties and tiny caps, made with care by hands that had clearly known what they were doing, packed away as if someone had always intended for a child to wear them. And every discovery felt less like luck and more like intention, like the house was revealing itself to her piece by piece, giving her exactly what she needed at exactly the moment she needed it. The first month was the hardest. She was alone in a way she had never been alone before. No other voices, no other footsteps, no one to tell her what to do or when to do it. The silence pressed on her like a weight, and there were nights when she cried into her pillow with a desperation that frightened her, nights when she talked to the baby just to hear the sound of her own voice. But she learned. She learned to manage the cold by keeping one fire going in the cast iron stove she found in the kitchen. She learned to ration her food, eating small meals that stretched the provisions as far as they would go. She learned to read by candlelight, working her way through the books on the shelves, novels and poetry and practical guides to gardening and animal husbandry, and 100 other skills she had never thought she would need. She learned that she was stronger than she had ever been allowed to believe, not invincible, not unafraid, but capable. Capable of waking up each morning and doing what needed to be done and surviving another day in a world that had tried to convince her she was worthless. Her body changed as the weeks passed. The baby grew heavier, more present, more real. She felt kicks and rolls and the strange pressure of another life, pressing against her from the inside, and she started talking to it, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried, but as a person, as her child. "I'm going to figure this out," she whispered at night, her hands pressed against her swollen belly. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to give you everything. I'm going to give you a life so good that you'll never feel the way I felt. I promise." The baby, of course, didn't answer, but somehow, making the promise felt like the first real thing Molly had done since she walked into this house. Like she was building something instead of just surviving something. Like she had a reason to keep going beyond the simple animal instinct to not die. It was December when she found the box. She had been organizing the parlor, pulling books off the shelves to dust them and arrange them in some kind of order, when she noticed that one section of the shelving seemed shallower than it should be. The back panel was wood instead of plaster, and when she pressed on it, it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a space about 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide. Inside the space was a metal box. She pulled it out with hands that trembled, though she couldn't have said why. The box was locked, but the key that had opened the padlock fit this lock too. The same key somehow, opening multiple doors. Inside, she found documents, yellowed papers and photographs, and a leather-bound journal that smelled like roses and old memories. She carried the box to the kitchen table and spread its contents in the light of the kerosene lamp. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand where she was and why she had been drawn here. The farmhouse had belonged to a woman named Rose Eleanor Mitchell. The name meant nothing to Molly at first, just letters on a deed, a face in a photograph. But as she read the journal, as she traced the threads of Rose Mitchell's life back through decades, she began to see patterns she couldn't explain. Rose had been born in 1920 in this house, to a family of farmers who worked the Oklahoma land when it was still possible to make a living from the soil. She had married young, lost her husband in the war, and never remarried. She had run this farm alone for 40 years, raising chickens and growing vegetables and slowly, painstakingly, saving every penny she earned. But she had also done something else, something that wasn't in any official record. She had taken in women, young women mostly, girls who had been cast out by their families for the kinds of sins that small towns never forgive: pregnancy, poverty, the wrong kind of love, the wrong kind of independence. She had given them shelter in this house. She had helped them through their pregnancies, taught them skills, connected them with opportunities in the wider world. And when they left, when they moved on to build lives of their own, she had recorded their names in the back of her journal. 87 names. 87 women who had passed through this house between 1952 and 1994, when Rose Eleanor Mitchell had died at the age of 74. The last entry in her journal, dated 3 months before her death, was addressed to no one and everyone, to whoever comes next. "I'm not going to be here to help you, but the house will remember. The house will give you what you need. Trust it. Trust yourself. And when you're ready, pass it on." Molly read the entry 7 times, the same way she had read the first note. And then she turned to the back of the journal, where Rose had listed her 87 names, and she looked at entry number 23. Rose Foster, pregnant at 17, arrived spring of 1963, left fall of 1964 with a baby girl. Rose Foster. Molly's grandmother had been named Rose. Rose Foster, who had died when Molly was 7, who had lived in Kansas and told stories about Oklahoma, who had never explained where she came from or how she had survived her own mother's disapproval of a pregnancy that no one talked about. Molly sat at the kitchen table as the lantern burned low, and she understood that she had not found this house by accident. She had been led here by blood, by history, by a thread of survival that stretched back through 3 generations of women who had been told they were worthless and had refused to believe it. The baby came in February. Molly had prepared as best she could, reading every medical book she could find in the house, stockpiling clean cloth and boiled water, and the few supplies she had managed to scavenge from abandoned outbuildings on nearby properties. But preparation couldn't make labor easy. It came in waves of pain that crashed over her like storms, and she rode them alone in the small bedroom, gripping the iron bed frame with hands that went white at the knuckles. She talked to her grandmother. She didn't know if Rose could hear her, didn't know if there was anything after death, anything beyond the simple facts of biology and time. But she talked anyway, because the sound of her own voice was the only comfort she had. "I'm scared, Grandma Rose. I'm so scared, but I'm not giving up. You didn't give up, and I'm not going to either." The baby was born at 3:17 a.m. on a night when the wind howled outside and the old house creaked and groaned like a ship in a storm. A girl, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, Molly guessed, because she didn't have a scale. Perfect and screaming and furious at being forced out of warmth into the cold world. Molly cut the cord with sterilized scissors from Rose's first aid kit. She cleaned the baby with warm water from a kettle on the stove. She wrapped her in one of the hand-knitted sweaters from the wooden crate, yellow yarn, soft as a whisper, and she held her daughter against her chest and cried the way the creek ran after a heavy rain. Fully, loudly, her voice filling the empty house with sounds of grief and joy and exhausted triumph. She named the baby Rose, Rose Eleanor Foster, for the grandmother who had survived this same house, for the woman who had built it into a sanctuary, for the thread of strength that ran through her blood and had carried her here, to this moment, to this beginning. The next 6 years were the hardest and best of Molly's life. She learned things she never thought she'd need to know: how to repair a leaking roof, how to grow vegetables in soil that hadn't been cultivated in decades, how to stretch a dollar so thin you could see through it. She found work in town eventually, a town called Holbrook, 12 miles east of the farmhouse, where nobody knew her history and nobody asked questions. She washed dishes at a diner. She cleaned offices at night. She took community college courses online, using the library's computers, chipping away at a nursing degree, 1 credit at a time, because she remembered the helplessness of giving birth alone and swore she would never let another woman feel that way if she could help it. Rose grew up in the farmhouse, surrounded by the same books and the same silence and the same stubborn love that had carried Molly through her darkest hours. She was a serious child, observant and thoughtful, with her mother's stubbornness and something else, something gentler, something that reminded Molly of photographs she'd seen of her grandmother as a young woman. Rose asked questions constantly, about the house, about the names in the journal, about the father she'd never met, and the grandparents who had never tried to find them. Molly answered as honestly as she could. She told Rose about Tyler, about Linda and Dale, about the night she had arrived at this house with $12 and no hope. She didn't soften the story. She didn't make excuses for the people who had failed them. But she also didn't dwell in bitterness, because bitterness, she had learned, was a poison that hurt the person who held it more than the people who deserved it. "We come from women who survived," Molly told her daughter. "That's what matters. Not the people who tried to break us. The people who got up and kept going." Rose was 6 years old when she asked the question that changed everything. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, rebuilt now, solid and painted white, nothing like the rotting structure Molly had found 7 years before, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and gold. "Mama," Rose said, in that serious way she had, "how come I've never met your parents? They're still alive, aren't they?" Molly had known the question would come eventually. She had rehearsed answers in her head, gentle deflections, age-appropriate explanations, the kind of careful language that protected children from truths they weren't ready for. But when she looked at her daughter's face, she couldn't bring herself to lie. "They are," Molly said, "but they didn't want me anymore. When I was pregnant with you, they told me to leave and never come back." Rose was quiet for a long time. The sunset faded into purple twilight. Crickets began to sing in the fields beyond the yard. Then Rose reached over and took Molly's hand, such a small hand, but so certain, and she said something that Molly would remember for the rest of her life. "Then they made a mistake," Rose said, "because you're the best mama in the whole world. And someday, when they realize what they missed, it's going to be too late." Molly pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tight, and she thought about the word someday. She had spent 7 years not thinking about her parents, not calling, not writing, not driving the 3 hours back to Kansas to see if anything had changed. She had built a new life, a good life, and she had told herself that the past was the past, and some doors were meant to stay closed. But hearing her daughter's words, feeling the weight of Rose's conviction, something stirred in Molly that she had thought was dead. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but curiosity, a need to know, a sense that the story wasn't finished, that somewhere in Kansas, in a yellow house on Chestnut Street, there were people who had made a choice they might regret. And Molly was no longer a scared 16-year-old with $12 and no power. She was a woman now, a mother, a survivor, and she was ready to find out what had become of the people who had thrown her away. She drove to Kansas on a Saturday in October, 8 years after the night her father had left her at the bus station. Rose stayed with a neighbor, a woman named Clara who had become something like family over the years, one of the few people Molly trusted with her daughter. The drive took 3 hours and 14 minutes, and every mile felt longer than the last. Molly didn't know what she was looking for. Closure, maybe. Answers. Or just the simple confirmation that she had survived something her parents had intended to destroy her. She pulled into Reading just after noon. The town looked the same, too small to have changed much in 8 years, too stubborn to let go of its routines and rhythms. She drove past the church, where she had sat through 17 years of sermons, past the school where she had learned to perform the daughter her parents wanted, past the garage where Tyler Beck had worked, which was now a tire shop with a different name. And then she turned onto Chestnut Street, and she saw the yellow house, and she stopped the car because she couldn't breathe. The house was the same yellow paint, though it looked faded now, peeling in places. The same shutters, though one was hanging crooked. The same driveway where her father's car had sat every evening, where he had loaded her bag into the trunk and driven her to the end of her childhood. But something was different. The yard, which Linda had always kept immaculate, was overgrown. The flower beds were choked with weeds, and in the front window, where her mother's lace curtains had always hung, there was nothing, just bare glass reflecting the October sky. Molly sat in her car for 19 minutes before she found the courage to get out. She walked up the cracked front path, past the mailbox with Foster still painted on the side in her father's careful hand. She climbed the porch steps, the same steps she had climbed 10,000 times as a child, and she knocked on the door. No one answered. She knocked again, harder, and heard a sound from inside, shuffling, slow, like someone moving through water. The door opened, and Molly found herself face to face with her father. He was old. That was the first thing she noticed, how much older he looked than 8 years should have made him. His hair was white where it had been gray, and sparse where it had been thick. His shoulders, always so rigid and proud, were stooped. His eyes, which had been cold and hard the last time she'd seen them, were something else now, something she didn't have a word for. He stared at her for a long moment. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. And when he finally spoke, his voice was nothing like the voice that had told her never to come back. His voice cracked like old wood under too much weight. "Molly?" She didn't answer. She just stood there watching him, this man who had been a giant in her childhood and was now just a tired old man in a stained undershirt, standing in the doorway of a house that had clearly not been cared for in years. Her mother appeared behind him, Linda, smaller than Molly remembered, her hair gray and wild, her housecoat wrinkled like she had been sleeping in it. Linda's face went through a sequence of expressions: shock, hope, fear, something that looked almost like shame, and then she said something that Molly had never expected to hear. "You came back. We didn't think you would come back." Molly had prepared speeches. She had rehearsed accusations and demands and all the things she had wanted to say for 8 years, but standing there, looking at these two broken people in their broken house, she couldn't remember any of them. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. "I have a daughter. Her name is Rose. She's 6 years old, and she asked me why she's never met you." The next 3 hours were the most difficult of Molly's life. She sat in the living room of her childhood home, the same floral couch, though it was worn now, the same family photographs on the wall, though they stopped at her 16th birthday, and she listened to her parents try to explain the inexplicable. Dale went first. He talked about pride and fear and the weight of other people's opinions, how he had convinced himself that cutting Molly off was the only way to protect the family's reputation, how he had told himself that she would be fine, that she would figure it out, that she was young and resilient and didn't really need them anyway. He cried while he talked. Molly had never seen her father cry. The sight of it didn't move her the way she might have expected. It felt distant, like watching a stranger's grief. Linda talked about regret, about the nights she had lain awake wondering where Molly was, whether she was safe, whether the baby had survived. She talked about wanting to look for her daughter, but being afraid of what she might find, afraid that Molly would reject her the way Linda had rejected Molly. She talked about the silence that had grown between her and Dale after Molly left, the way the house had felt like a tomb, the way neither of them could bring themselves to acknowledge what they had done. And Molly listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just sat there, absorbing the confessions of two people who had once been the center of her world and were now strangers who happened to share her blood. When they were finished, when the silence stretched out like a held breath, Molly spoke. She told them about the bus station, about walking for 2 hours in the dark while pregnant and terrified, about finding the farmhouse and surviving the winter and giving birth alone with no one to help her. She told them about Rose Eleanor Mitchell, the great-great-aunt neither of them had known existed, who had built a sanctuary for women just like Molly. She told them about 6 years of night classes and double shifts and fighting for every inch of the life she had built. And she told them about Rose, about their granddaughter, who was smart and kind and fierce, who asked hard questions and deserved honest answers, who wanted to know why she had never met her grandparents. Dale broke down completely. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed with a grief that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than 8 years of absence. Linda just sat there, tears streaming down her face, looking at Molly like she was seeing a ghost. "We were wrong," Dale said finally, his voice hoarse and broken. "We were so wrong. We threw you away like you were nothing, and you were everything. And we didn't see it until it was too late." "Is it too late?" Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it too late for us to know her? To know you again?" Molly thought about the question. She thought about Rose, waiting at Clara's house, not knowing whether this trip would bring answers or more silence. She thought about the years of loneliness, the nights of crying into her pillow, the rage she had carried like a stone in her chest. And she thought about what she had learned from the farmhouse, from the journal, from the 87 names of women who had survived worse than she had. Forgiveness, Rose Eleanor Mitchell had written in one of her later entries, isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about deciding that you're not going to let it destroy you anymore. It's about setting yourself free. Molly looked at her parents, broken, ashamed, desperate for a redemption they hadn't earned. And she made a choice. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something else. A door cracked open, a possibility. "I don't know if it's too late," she said, "but I'm willing to find out." The road back was different from the road there. Molly drove with the windows down, feeling the October air on her face, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that might happen next. She had given her parents her phone number. She had shown them a photograph of Rose, their granddaughter, who had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's smile. She had told them that if they wanted to be part of her life, they would have to earn it, slowly, carefully, with actions, not words. And they had agreed. Whether they would follow through, whether they were capable of becoming the parents they should have been 18 years ago, she didn't know. But she had given them the chance. That was more than they had given her. When she got home, Rose was waiting on the porch of the farmhouse, watching for her car the way Molly had once watched for her father's taillights that would never return. Molly parked and got out, and Rose ran to her and threw her arms around her waist. "What happened, Mama? Did you find them? Are they nice?" Molly knelt down so she was eye level with her daughter. She looked into those serious, searching eyes, so much wisdom for such a small person, and she told the truth. "I found them. They're sad. They made a lot of mistakes, but they want to try to be better, and I'm going to let them try." Rose considered this with her usual gravity. Then she nodded. "That's brave," she said. "Grandma Rose would be proud of you." Molly pulled her daughter close and breathed in the smell of her hair, the smell of home and safety, and everything she had built from nothing. She thought about the farmhouse behind them, the sanctuary that had saved her life. She thought about the journal with its 87 names, the women who had passed through these rooms and gone on to build lives of their own. And she thought about the future, about Rose growing up, about the nursing degree she was 2 semesters away from finishing, about the possibility that her parents might actually change. 3 years later, Dale and Linda Foster drove to Oklahoma for Christmas dinner. They sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, the same table where Molly had first read Rose Eleanor Mitchell's words, and they met their granddaughter for the first time. Dale cried. Linda couldn't stop touching Rose's hair, her face, her hands, like she was afraid the child would disappear if she looked away. And Rose, who was 9 years old by then, and had her mother's stubbornness and her namesake's wisdom, looked at these 2 old people she had never met and said something that made everyone in the room go quiet. "I'm glad you finally came," she said, "but you should know, my mama is the best person I know, and if you hurt her again, I won't forgive you." Dale looked at Molly. Linda looked at Molly, and Molly felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication exactly, but a kind of peace. Her daughter knew her worth. Her daughter wouldn't accept crumbs from anyone, not even family. Her daughter was exactly the person Molly had promised to raise that night in the farmhouse when she was 16 and terrified and alone. A person who knew how to survive. A person who knew how to love. A person who would never, ever let anyone make her feel small. The Fosters stayed for 3 days. They helped with dishes. They listened to stories about the nursing program, about Clara and the neighbors who had become family, about the farmhouse and its history, and the women who had passed through it. They didn't try to explain or justify or make excuses anymore. They just listened and learned and slowly, carefully began to rebuild something they had destroyed a decade before. It wasn't perfect. Molly knew it would never be perfect. There were years they couldn't get back, wounds that would never fully heal. But there was also this. A table with food on it, a child laughing in the next room, 2 old people who had traveled 3 hours to say they were sorry with more than words, and that was enough. Not forgiveness exactly, not peace, but something more fundamental than either. A beginning, a chance, a door that had been locked for a very long time, finally, slowly, opening. If you're watching this right now, if you're someone who has been thrown away by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to take something from this story. Not the reconciliation. That's not the point. The point is what Molly did before the reconciliation was ever possible. She survived. She built. She refused to let the people who discarded her define who she was going to become. She found a locked farmhouse on a dark road when she had nothing left, and she turned it into a home. She gave birth alone and raised a daughter alone and earned a nursing degree alone, not because being alone was noble, but because she had no other choice. And she made that choice count for something. The people who hurt you may never apologize. They may never change. They may never show up at your door asking for a second chance. And if they don't, that doesn't mean you failed. That doesn't mean your survival was any less remarkable. What matters is that you keep going. What matters is that you build something, a life, a family, a purpose that belongs to you and no one else. What matters is that somewhere, out there, there's a locked door with a key that's waiting for you. And when you find it, when you turn that key and step inside, you'll discover that what's been waiting for you all along isn't a place or a thing. It's yourself. The version of you that the world tried to destroy. The version that's still here, still standing, still strong enough to begin again.